Okay, well, I was just thinking as we were doing the actions there, that when you come to a new church, there's so many things that you need to learn, all the things that people think are important, like how you take the collection and who the stewards are and all that. The really important thing you need to learn is how they do the actions to the different songs, because different churches have different ways of doing actions, and I thought yours were wonderful. Well done. Thank you very much. So, today, we're thinking about resurrection. Often in the weeks after Easter, we would take one particular resurrection story and we might unpick it and see what we learn about Jesus and what it can teach us. I'd like to do something slightly different with you today, and that is to look at the concept of resurrection as a whole. And the thing that made me sort of pick up on this idea is that I was very struck by the fact that the Synoptic Gospels tell us that 3 times Jesus told his disciples that he, the Son of Man, must go to Jerusalem, he would be killed, and he would rise again. They don't quite all tell us the resurrection bit, but most of them do. 3 times he told them that. And yet, when it happened, nothing rang any bells in the back of their minds. So when those women went from the tomb to say, this is what we've learnt, they said, your words are like nonsense. Why wasn't it that they said, oh, didn't he say something about that? Do you remember, when we were wandering around here, or we were walking there, or we were having a meal with this person, didn't he say something about coming back to life? No, nothing rang any bells. And when the people walking to Emmaus were walking, and Jesus, although they didn't know it was Jesus, joined them and explained the Old Testament and showed how the prophets and the law were leading to his death and his resurrection, even then they didn't think, oh, hang on a minute, I wonder if what the women said was right. It wasn't until he stopped and broken the bread that they stopped and said, this is Jesus. And I thought, this must have been such a strong teaching. Why was it that nothing rang any bells with them? Which then led me on to think, what was their understanding of resurrection at the time? And was it, well, I think it probably was, so strong that even though Jesus himself said it's going to be something different, they couldn't take it on board? So for the first part of this morning, I want to do, this is a very quick, although it may not feel like it, a run through where the disciples were at that time. So this is very hard for us because we know how the story ends. So it's quite difficult to do this. But if we can we put ourselves in the position of those disciples, perhaps on that Saturday in between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and think, what was their understanding at that point, such that when Jesus rose on the Sunday, they were not expecting it. It was a complete shock and surprise to them. So, first of all, for most people at the time of Jesus, those who didn't have a faith, particularly a Jewish faith, but maybe some other faiths as well, this was what they understood about resurrection or life after death. There wasn't anything. There was nothing. Most people at the time thought that when you died, that was it. So one particular philosopher put it like this. He said, first of all, I wasn't. So before you're on this earth, you weren't. Then I was, like here. Then I am not. And because of that, I don't care. And many people had this put on their tombstone. So in other words, the only thing that matters is what you do here on earth. That before, I wasn't. Then I was, ran around doing all the things that you do. Then you die, which means I am not. There is no life after death. That's the end of it. And therefore, I don't care because I'm not. So it doesn't matter whether you care or you don't care. That's the position of most people at the time of Jesus. Not Jews, but most other people in the rest of the world. So then, what of the disciples themselves? They are Jewish, and therefore their understanding would come from the Old Testament. Hasn't really been put together as the Old Testament, but scriptures are certainly there for them to use in various ways. So, three main things come through the Old Testament to do with life after death and resurrection. But the main one is that death is the end. So the main message of life after death in the Old Testament is that death is the end. Now, it didn't mean that once people died, they were no more, but that they existed, but in a very low level of consciousness, a bit like being asleep, perhaps. That's maybe a way in which we can understand it. So for a large section of the Old Testament, there isn't really a sense of life after death and something to look forward to or some sort of hope after that. However, from that developed the idea, really from their understanding that God is with them during life, then came the understanding that if God is with you during life, then surely God is still with you when you're not alive, when you're dead. So this isn't a sort of resurrection, big life after death, big banquet or anything like that, but it is a sense of the God who was walking alongside you in life will still be there for you when you are in death, but death is still this sort of falling asleep type thing. However, towards the end of the time of the Old Testament, there does develop a bit of an idea about resurrection from death. This wasn't something that was going to happen at the point that somebody died, so that they would be alive, they'd die, they'd then sleep, and then after that there would be some sense of resurrection. Daniel speaks, the prophet Daniel speaks in a short while of people who are righteous shining as stars forevermore. So there's a hint there of some sort of resurrection for people who are righteous. And the prophet Ezekiel, I'm sure many of you know the passage where he's shown a large number of bones of people. And he has this conversation with God. And God says, if they hear God's word, if you preach to them, and through my breath, through my understanding, they will come back to life again. So there is just a small amount of the idea of a resurrection in the Old Testament, but most of it is that actually there isn't a sense of resurrection and a life improving later. Now, the next bit is it's just slightly complicated. At the point that Jesus is alive, the Old Testament has been completed. There's nothing more written into the Old Testament 200 or 300 years earlier, but ideas continue to develop. So by the time that Jesus is alive and he's working with his disciples and his followers, more ideas have developed, but we don't find them in the Old Testament. So we have to find them from other sources, including the Gospels, interestingly. So just a couple of things to underline for you. Sadducees. You know about the Pharisees, don't you, who had many fallings out with Jesus. Sadducees are a different group of Jewish people. They have a lot of influence. They have quite a large say over Jewish people. They look at them and they follow them. Sadducees believed nothing happened after death. Okay, so at the time of Jesus, one large grouping were teaching, when you die, and that is the end. If you ever want to be able to remember whether it's the Sadducees or the Pharisees who don't believe in life after death, it's the Sadducees because they are sad, you see. So, I too can do the soup jokes. That having been said, in the time that Jesus is alive and his disciples are there, so not found in the Old Testament, but ideas that developed in Judaism at that time, there is an increased belief in a resurrection. More people come to believe that if God is with you after death, then he would want more for you than simply sleeping for eternity. However, a couple of things that are really important here. One is that this resurrection is not for one individual, it's for a nation. So God is working through Israel, and therefore Israel will be resurrected. And it's therefore not one person, but it's all of God's people, which is basically Israel. They will have a new life, a new creation, a new way of working, and that in order for that to happen, those who have died will be brought back to life. They will be put together with the people who are still alive, and God's work will sort of take on a new way of working. The crucial thing here is that the disciples who are following Jesus are all Jewish. The majority of his followers are Jewish people. So their understanding of resurrection is that death is either it's this semi-state of being asleep. You've got an influential group telling you that after life there is nothing, you die and that's the end of it. And you've got an increased understanding that there is a resurrection, but it's not for you and you and you, it's a national thing. Okay, so the idea that one person, as Jesus was saying, would rise from the dead is totally contrary to their understanding. That is not something that features at all. So, just to turn to the Gospels very quickly here, I just want to show you how in the Gospels some of these ideas of the sort of swirling around about resurrection we can actually find in the Gospels. So the Gospels aren't simply telling us what Jesus said, what Jesus did, how his followers reacted. It's telling us something about the society at the time, and therefore maybe where the disciples are. These are the ideas that they have in their minds. There is a complicated question that the Sadducees put to Jesus. We haven't got time to look at it in detail here. Remember, Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So this is a trick question, and they ask him, in our culture, if a man marries a woman and he dies, then the woman would then marry his next brother down. And then they say, in this family of 7 brothers, and the woman marries one of them, and then he dies and marries the next, and they all die. I did think to myself, if you marry 7 people and they all die and you remain living, you might just check what's going in the food, mightn't you? I don't think that was the point, but it's slightly suspicious, isn't it? Anyway, so their question was, if that's our culture, after life, will people still be married to each other? And this is not a real question, this is a trick question, because they want him to say, oh yes they will, or no they won't, and they're going to say, ha, but life after death doesn't actually happen. So it's not a real question, but the interesting thing to us is here is, if you're going to say to me, how do you know about the Sadducees? I know about them partly because they're in the Gospels. So the Gospels tell us about some of these different ideas that are swirling around. Similarly, Matthew and Luke tell us, do you remember the passages where Jesus says, don't worry about this world, don't worry if people, don't be concerned about people who can harm the body, but worry about treasures in heaven and worry about what you're storing up in heaven and so forth. So there is Jesus talking about an afterlife, but is that for the nation or is that for one person? Just the idea. Jairus' daughter who died, a message goes to Jesus, will he come and see? And he says, don't worry, she's just asleep. So then I thought, just asleep? Was that him saying she's asleep, knowing that she died and he was going to raise her again? Or asleep? Was that one of those cultural understandings of what death actually was? So that actually he was saying, yes, she is dead, but we're going to call it sleeping because that's what Jewish people believed at the time. And then these 3 times that Jesus himself predicts his passion and his resurrection. So that, as I say, this is contrary to Jewish teaching. And I think that in order to sort of get behind what's going on in the Gospels and to get behind some of the disciples' understanding and to really sort of get to grips with what they're saying, we need to somehow drop into our minds that they were not expecting the resurrection of one person. They were expecting a resurrection for all of them. And therefore, when Jesus said, I must die and be raised again, I just think, you know how sometimes you're told things and it doesn't relate at all to anything you know, so you don't take it in. It just goes over your head. And I just wonder if exactly the same thing happened to them. So that when he did rise 3 days later, then they didn't think, oh, that's what he said, because they'd forgotten about what he'd said, because it was as if nonsense to them. This is not what they thought God was going to be about. So the disciples seem to me to be completely dense. You know, I don't understand. I do understand why they didn't understand about the resurrection, but I don't understand why they didn't stop and think, oh yes, that's what he told us about. But when we stop and think, they've had generations of teaching that resurrection is for the nation, and it's a completely different concept to the idea of one person, a Messiah, coming, living, and then dying, then maybe we can have a bit more sympathy with where they're coming from. So we're going to leave that there. Are we singing again now? So we're going to sing, and then we're going to spend just a short time looking at Luke's Gospel and what he tells us about resurrection, not so much in one particular story, but in general. So please be seated. So in Luke's Gospel, obviously there are some resurrection stories, although I say obviously, not all Gospels have one. We heard the first part of it as we did our cutting out. So for the first, 12 verses in the last chapter of Luke, all we actually hear is that the women went and saw an angel and that Peter went and saw the linen cloths. It's not till the next bit of the story that we actually meet the risen Christ. So we're going to hear now the next little section, which is the road to Emmaus.
It starts off, they got up. That's the two who were on the road to Emmaus, and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Amen.
Resurrection in Luke's Gospel. Luke has these resurrection stories at the end, the women that we've heard, the road to Emmaus, and then Jesus appearing and saying, I'll prove to you that I'm not a ghost. Have you got some fish? I'll eat the fish, and by eating it, I am a fully fledged human, but who has raised from the dead. So Luke has these resurrection stories, and obviously they're important, but what I want to just underline to you today is that resurrection in Luke's gospel is not just the climax to this story. We haven't simply got Jesus doing his ministry, doing his teaching, doing his healing, building relationships, then dying, and then the climax, resurrection. Here it is, important though that is, that actually resurrection is a theme throughout the whole of Luke's gospel. We haven't got time to talk very much about these. You might like to pick them up later when you get home, but I'll just touch on a few of them. The birth stories. I think this is really interesting. We might possibly look at it in a couple of weeks' time. There are many reflections of what happens in the birth story and what happens at the time of the resurrection. For example, how did the women know what had happened? Is because an angel had told them, an angel has said, this is what God has done, this is where you will find Jesus, this is who Jesus is. Cast your minds back to Christmas. How did the women, Mary in particular, but also the shepherds, know about Jesus? It was because angels told them. Indeed, there's a synergy, isn't there, between the swaddling clothes and the linen cloth. That's how you will recognise him, by these things that are either there or aren't. So there are many, many reflections which I think are very interesting. But also, if you remember, in Luke's Gospel, these are things that are only in Luke's Gospel. So without Luke, we wouldn't know about them. Simeon and Anna, old people who have worked in the temple for many, many years, looking for the Messiah. And Jesus is brought in as a baby, and they recognise who he is. But it's not simply this is God's Messiah. They also talk about the rising and the falling of Israel. They talk about death, and resurrection and new life is also there. The widow of Nain. This is a woman who is a widow, so her husband has died, and Jesus is walking along when the funeral procession is taking place for her son. This is her only son. So she's a widow and her only son has died. This is completely different things. It's showing Luke's interest in women. This is an economic disaster for the woman, because she now has no economic way of surviving. And Jesus brings the young man back to life again. What do we discover? The crowd are amazed, and they step forward and say, this must be God. This is truly extraordinary. Through Luke, resurrection all the time. This is a tragedy, and Jesus brings God's touch to it. The stories of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. It's easy to see death and resurrection here, isn't there? The person who was beaten up and left as if for dead, and it's the Samaritan who brings new life, who picks him up, takes him to the hostel, pays for him. Here is a picture of death and resurrection. And the prodigal son, the younger brother who takes all the money and disappears and spends it all and is as if dead, really. His life is so grim that he says, I'll go back and say, I'm sorry, and can I just work as a servant? And his father, picture of God, welcomes him and gives him the clothes, restores his status. And the older brother, with whom I have to say I have so much sympathy, says, this isn't fair, this isn't right, I'm here, I've worked all this time, I can't have a party. And the father says, we must celebrate your brother who was lost and is found, who was dead and is now alive. Resurrection is still there. And lastly, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This is a difficult parable, but I'd just like to underline that in this story, the question of an afterlife and resurrection seems very tied in with justice. So that's another enormous theme to throw out to you, but one that maybe another time we could also unpick. So what I want to say to you from Luke's Gospel, which was there for Jesus' disciples and his followers and for us today is that, if we just put the next slide up, I'm sorry, I've put my clicker down somewhere. Thank you. Somebody wrote, resurrection becomes a metaphor, a picture for what is going on in the ministry of Jesus itself. In other words, Jesus said in a different gospel, I have come to give you life and life in abundance. A picture of resurrection. So his teaching brings a story of new hope, new life, new creation. In his healings, when he takes people who are struggling with life because they can't see, they can't walk, whatever their particular problem is, he brings new life, new creation, and abundant life. So resurrection for Luke's gospel, and resurrection for Jesus, and resurrection for all of his followers is not just simply what happens on that first Easter day, important though that is for affirming our faith. It is actually the story of what Jesus came to do. That new life is there, new creation, abundant life in the words that he said and the deeds that he carried out. And that mission has been passed on to us today, so that we not only for ourselves can see that day by day by day, Jesus is giving us new life, new creation. He's turning things around for us. He's giving us a new perspective. He's giving us a new way of looking at things. And once we've grasped that for ourselves, then, as in so many stories in Luke's gospel, we need to tell others, this is the new life that Jesus has come to bring. We are new creations. Life in all its fullness, life in its abundancy. And every page that you turn of Luke's gospel virtually, you will see a picture of death and resurrection. That's what Jesus came to do, and it's what Jesus is still doing today through people who follow him.